Before we become wise, we become loud. We try to be seen, heard, understood. We chase books, mentors, milestones, anything that might grant us certainty. But what if wisdom doesn't raise its hand? What if it just waits? This is not a story about advice. There are no turning points, no dramatic awakenings, just a quiet man and another, still becoming one. If you listen closely, you might not hear answers, but you'll feel something shift. Let's begin. He wasn't the kind of man you noticed in a crowd. Not anymore. Age had taken the sharpness from his voice, the weight from his walk, but it hadn't touched his eyes. His eyes were the kind that didn't just look at you, they looked through time. And if you stood still long enough, you might feel them asking a question you weren't ready to answer. But that morning, the young man didn't notice. He walked right past him, too focused on becoming someone to ever pause long enough to ask who he already was. He had headphones in, phone in one hand, coffee in the other, and urgency in his stride, the kind of urgency you carry when you believe everything depends on you moving faster. He pushed through the cafe door, barely catching the bell above, ordered his drink before he even looked up, tapped his foot while waiting, mind scrolling through to-do lists, messages, expectations. It was only as he turned to leave that something or someone finally caught his peripheral vision. A man older, still, sitting alone by the window, steam rising from a simple cup of black coffee, a notebook half open, a pen untouched. They made eye contact for just a second. The old man nodded, not as a greeting, but as if acknowledging something only he could see. The young man returned the nod, but only halfway. Not out of rudeness, just distraction. He didn't stay long enough to wonder why that glance lingered. But the barista said something as he left, soft, offhand. "You know he built this place right years ago, with his bare hands. Didn't take a day off for 2 decades. Raised his kids behind that counter. Most people walk by him now like he's part of the furniture." The young man paused, turned his head back toward the window. The old man was still there, sipping slowly, watching the rain begin. Not rushing, not reaching, not needing to be seen. The young man stood at the door a moment longer, then left. And the old man, he didn't move. We chase the future so hard, we forget to see the men who've already been there. 2 weeks later, he returned. Not because he missed anything, not even out of curiosity, but because something unnameable, persistent had taken root in his mind, like a memory you don't fully understand but can't quite shake. The cafe looked the same. Raindrops clung to the outside glass like forgotten thoughts. And the old man sat in the same spot by the window, where the evening light always softened before it disappeared. This time, the young man didn't hesitate at the door. He walked straight to the table across from the old man. No introduction, no explanation. The old man didn't flinch, didn't ask why. He simply nodded, as if he'd seen this return happen many times before, not in faces, but in patterns. The young man spoke quietly. "Can I ask you something?" The old man raised a hand slightly, not in permission, but in welcome. A door left open. "What's one thing you wish you knew when you were my age?" The old man didn't answer immediately. He turned his gaze toward the window, where a child was running in the rain, holding a melting ice cream cone. His expression softened, as if the answer didn't live in words, but in the image outside. Then, with no ceremony, he spoke. "I wish I'd understood that not everything that feels urgent is truly important." The young man frowned. That's it? No further thoughts? No explanation? No story? No context to help it land? The old man lifted his cup and took a slow sip. His eyes weren't cold, nor were they waiting for approval. They were simply the eyes of a man who knew if something needs explaining, it probably hasn't been earned. The young man stayed seated for another few minutes. He didn't press. Then, he stood. And this time, he nodded first before leaving. Real answers don't need to be loud, only timely. He left the cafe in silence. It wasn't dramatic, but it wasn't forgettable either. That sentence, so simple it was almost insulting, kept knocking on some unopened door inside him. Not everything that feels urgent is important. He repeated it not to understand, but to challenge it, to prove it wrong. To him, it sounded like surrender, like permission to stop trying. It rubbed against every belief he held about ambition, drive, and earning your worth. No, he thought, that can't be right. If I don't treat everything like it matters, I'll fall behind. So he ran harder. He worked late, woke early, scheduled every hour. He treated rest like weakness. And every action became a silent argument with the old man's calm. He didn't go back to the cafe, not because he forgot, but because returning might mean admitting that something had landed. But life doesn't stay quiet forever. One day, the cracks appeared. The job became a cage. The relationship he tried so hard to keep slipped through his grip. And the goals, the ones that once made his chest burn, now echoed hollow. Still, he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. But something shifted. The sentence stopped making him angry. It started making him quiet. The ego resists most what it secretly fears is true. Life doesn't warn you. It just begins taking things away. Not with storms, but with silence. Not through failure, but through successes that suddenly feel hollow. The young man, no longer so young, started to feel the spaces between his achievements. The emails answered. The praise received. The meetings booked. Everything he once chased came. And yet none of it made his chest rise. He began to notice he couldn't sit still for more than 10 minutes. That every connection he had was built on goals, outcomes, transactions. That each day felt like a checklist with no reason to pause, only pressure to proceed. And in the quiet nights, when there was nothing left to prove and no one left to impress, that old sentence returned like a visitor once ignored. Not everything that feels urgent is important. But this time, it didn't irritate him. It softened him. One day, waiting at a crosswalk as the city marched past him, he remembered the old man's first glance. The patience that didn't beg to be understood. The peace that didn't ask for approval. And for the first time in years, he asked himself, am I living by my choices or by momentum? Time doesn't raise its voice. It teaches by taking back what you thought you couldn't live without. Long after the fire had dimmed and newer questions replaced old ambitions, he returned, not for a reason, not because someone asked. Just one quiet afternoon, with golden light spilling across the sidewalk, he found himself standing in front of that cafe. It looked smaller now. Or maybe he had finally outgrown the version of himself that once rushed through its door. He stepped inside. Everything felt strangely familiar. The window seat, the wooden table, the chair that still creaked when you shifted your weight. But the old man wasn't there. The barista was different, younger. He asked, the man who used to sit there, does he still come by? She looked up gently. Mr. Howard? He passed a few years back, peacefully, right there in that chair. There was nothing more to say. He looked toward the seat, not to find him, but to finally face himself. He walked over, Saturday down. No coffee, no notebook, just stillness. Outside, the wind played against the window. Someone walked by, glanced in, and kept moving. And in that quiet for the first time, he didn't try to understand, didn't need to explain, didn't ask for clarity. He simply listened, not to a voice, but to the silence the old man had left behind. By the time we're finally ready to hear, the silence has already spoken. Final reflections, the man he became. He once believed the world demanded noise, that he had to prove himself in every room, win every argument, move faster than time. But the old man never raised his voice, never chased approval. He simply lived and left behind something greater than legacy, a presence. Now, the young man carries it, not on his shoulders, but in how he walks, how he listens, how he lets things pass that once consumed him. He doesn't call it stoicism, or mastery, or strength, but when he breathes deeply, when he pauses instead of reacting, when silence becomes enough, he realizes he's no longer chasing the man he admired. He's becoming him.